Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between. I was so excited to interview today's guest, Oliver Burkeman. Both of his books, well, he's got a ton of books, but 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals is a book that caught my eye years ago. I think I was probably in a bookstore or the airport somewhere. And obviously, anything that has to do with mortality always catches my eye. So I was super excited when his publisher reached out to talk about his new book, Meditations for Mortals, 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts. And what I love so much about this conversation is that we talk about meditation, but not in the way you think traditionally about meditation, because Oliver had a little bit of a different spin on that, which I don't think he fully realized when he was writing the book, as he talks about in this interview. But we had an amazing conversation, not just about that, about what it means to face your mortality, about how facing your mortality helps you to live better, and the tiny, super subtle changes you can make in your everyday life that will make a big, big difference. And we go back and forth a little bit on what it means to just do it, to just get started, get moving, and make the changes you need in your life versus really thinking about and analyzing those changes. So I know that you are going to love this episode. I was also super excited because he was going to be on a much larger platform in Chicago. So it was kind of serendipitous that I had the opportunity to interview him before that. But make sure you listen to the whole interview and check out his new book, Meditation for Mortals. Are you looking for stories of hope and positivity? If you are, then you need to check out Inside Wink. It's a new podcast that I recently was turned on to, and I think you are going to love it too. It's hosted by Jean Trebek and Allison Martin, and Inside Wink delves into the lives of inspiring guests who are making a difference. They encourage kinder living, reveal silver linings, and see the world's perpetual generosity and explore new and unconventional ideas to make the world a better place. It's a podcast that truly does feel like this little ray of sunshine and a warm hug. And you will love listening to the guests in their conversations with Allison and Jean. From activist to artist, every episode brings you closer to the heart of meaningful change. So tune in to Inside Wink for stories that uplift and inspire, because every good deed starts with a story. Welcome, Oliver. I'm so excited you're here, especially like the day before your book launches. And I've seen you on all kinds of bestseller lists already. So this is a super exciting interview for me to have. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
So, okay, first of all, I've seen and read 4,000 Weeks a while ago. Here it is. Time Management for Mortals. For me, the part that totally caught my attention was the For Mortals piece, and how I think about mortality is a real eye opener for how to live. And your current book, Meditation for Mortals. So my first question is, what is it about mortality in your mind? And how did you come to mortality sort of being the hook in all of this to get people to pay attention?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Can you cut out the bits where I have a coughing fit? Is that acceptable?
Sure. We'll cut out whatever again. We need to.
I'll start again. I mean, part of what I really like about the For Mortals idea is that it's just sort of funny in a way, because the language implies that I'm like niching down and just talking to the people who this is relevant to, but that category of people is anyone who's going to die. So it's not very.
So it's not relevant to me.
It's not very niche down, right? And it's a reminder, because we all want to think we are the one exception. I think the thing that is really central to all this for me is maybe not so much kind of death and dying, which is obviously completely central to everything. And I'm not sure I'm any more reconciled to that than anyone else, but the sort of finitude that follows as a result of the fact that we are mortal. So it's the fact that we have such limited time, but also limited control over how that time unfolds, limited understanding of what the heck's going on in the world or with other people or in ourselves. All those limitations are sort of what being immortal implies to me. And so time management for mortals, just, I like the combination of a sort of very kind of down to earth seeming concept like time management with this reminder of the fact that ultimately time management, if it means anything, means what it means in the context of our finitude. And then meditations for mortals is a sort of, I guess it's an extension of that in a way, but I can talk more about that, the new book, but it's I guess it's just that reminder that like, this is all of us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think what's interesting about how you approach this as someone who reads a lot of books on meditation, I was expecting something different.
I'm growing aware that the use of the word meditations in the title is going to cause some people to believe that it's a book about sitting on a cushion and following your breath, or obviously it's not the only form of meditation that there is. If I am using that phrase in a sort of tradition, I guess it's more like the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, right? It's reflections to sort of take on a daily basis. Maybe we can talk a bit about the structure of the book, which is very important to me anyway. But
yeah,
it's not, I mean, there's some overlap, right, between what you're doing when you meditate in one sense of the word and when you meditate upon an idea. They are not unrelated, but no, it's meditations with an S. But I'm sure plenty of people are going to think it's a book about meditation. Sorry if so.
No. I mean, it isn't. I mean, I think that if we broaden the scope of what we think meditation is, it's really kind of narrowing down to like one thing, right? Like when we sit in meditation, maybe we focus on our breath or we focus on a visualization. And here you're teaching like focus on one concept, one thing that you can change in your life. And I love, there's so many that I really loved. And just to talk a little bit, do you want to talk a little bit about the structure of the book? Because it is 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts. I just got the book like early last week, so I did not have 4 weeks. So I read it all very quickly. But tell us a little bit about like how the book is structured in terms of how it helps us think about living our life, because you really build out, I mean, a lot of what you wrote is a lot of how I think. And I have questions about that too, because it was interesting to think about who's informed maybe your thinking in this space.
Yeah, I mean, as we can discuss, I think a big sort of central idea in the book is this notion that it's incredibly easy to kind of postpone a full-throated and full-hearted engagement with life out of some notion that you're going to, first of all, sort your life out or get organized or fix your problems or figure out what's going on. And so one of the things that was important to me in the structure of the book was not to turn this or allow this to be another thing that you could sort of, that the reader could treat as a kind of system that was going to change everything later when they put it into practice in some perfect fashion several months from now or something. So the 4-week structure with a short chapter each day for each day of the 4 weeks. Obviously, I can't control how people actually read this book. I recognize that. It's not a problem. But the invitation is to sort of consider reading one per day. I think there's a lot of benefit in just the pacing aspect of that. There's something meditative, actually, to your point about holding back from racing through it. It's different if you're preparing for a podcast that you host, I think.
Right.
And also then just to allow these little insights and perspective shifts to take root right there and then, like in the day that you have after you read that chapter, not storing it all up into a big system that you're going to be perfectionistic about later, but just, you read a chapter on decision making, and it makes some tiny change in how you actually confront a decision that arises that day. I think that's much more powerful. That sort of approach has been for me anyway. And I wanted the book to sort of be an instance of getting people over the gap from knowing to doing, as well as just be about that topic, I guess.
So you actually start the book with this notion of creating systems, and that we create all of these systems, these lists, these ways of getting things done. Tell us what you talk about in the book is the best way to get things done.
I mean, I say early on in the book, right? If you've got to this point, you're probably expecting my system now, because I'm not spoiling much. No, I have read so many books where I'm like, okay, let's get past the intro. Tell me the system that's going to solve everything. I'm going to put it into place, and it's going to basically make life smooth from now on. And I try to differentiate myself here by refusing to give a system, not because there aren't useful techniques and methods, and I do mention a lot of those in the book, but because I think that urge to systematize, to sort of turn what we're talking about here into a long-term project of habit formation or personality change, become the kind of person who is on top of their to-do lists, or who always makes time for seated meditation or exercise or whatever it is. For various different reasons, this ends up making it harder and to actually make the change, because we adopt this kind of very daunting project of life change. We tell ourselves that there's something fundamentally wrong with us that we've got to resolve before we can do this stuff. And the sort of very annoying truth, as I say in that chapter, is that the most effective way to get around to doing something that you know you want to do in your life, or show up in the world in a specific way, is just to do that thing for 10 minutes today, or 20 minutes today. It's not to figure out how you're going to become a consistent meditator. It is to do 10 minutes meditation today, no matter how ignorant you are of how to do it, no matter how imperfect it is, no matter how completely unsure you are that you're ever going to find time or motivation to do it again. And the same would go for, creative work, or, being more attentive in your relationships or with your children or something. A classic example of this in my case, back a while ago now, would be that I would think to myself, I'm a bit too distracted by work, and sometimes even by screen devices in the presence of our son. And then my mind immediately goes to, all right, so my new plan has to be that I keep the phone somewhere separate, that I always go through certain processes to make sure all the loose ends are tied up from work. I need to meditate because that'll help my attention. And I got this whole plan, which is just then, just creates an obstacle to doing something. What I needed to do in those moments, and I try to get better at it, is just to be in a listening, attentive space with my son for 20 minutes, right? Just to actually do the thing. We put up so many barriers to actually just doing the thing. And a lot of them are quite sneaky, because they seem like stepping stones to doing the thing.
Right. And I mean, Nike clearly had it right when they said, just do it. And, as I found myself reading through the lens of a psychologist, I was thinking about all those times where, I talk in session with someone and I say, okay, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and then they come back and they're like, I didn't do it. And then we spend, an entire session trying to understand what it is about what they didn't do, right? And the things that we want to do, we very easily do. I believe that. And so I think, and I think that there are things that we resist. And sometimes there is some underlying reason for resisting some of that. And sometimes it is just literally just do it. There's not much more complicated. There's not much more to it than that. What is the problem with you just doing it?
Right.
And
right.
I think
no,
people
absolutely.
come up, with all sorts of excuses and all kinds of, like you said, these methods of, well, if I just, have the clutter all put away, then I can. And I think what you're saying is like, well, but you're mortal.
Right. At some point, it's going to have to be in a present moment, because otherwise, when's it going to be? And we don't have that many of them. Yeah, and I don't know if that's what you meant, but I think you touched on something interesting and important there, which is another angle I'm sort of pursuing in this book is that sort of self-forcing in a way that I have long experience of is not is not a helpful thing to do. That focusing on what we want to do and feel like doing is a really important part of the sort of approach of building a meaningful life. And so a legitimate reason to not just do something is that you, in a deep and intuitive sense, are not feeling it. I think that's a real thing to listen to. So it's not about saying, I think I should write in my journal, and instead of setting up this whole detailed practice, I'm going to force myself to do it. Maybe you shouldn't be doing it in that case. It's more those situations where, as you say, like, you know what you want to do, you want to do it, and some combination of fear or desire to feel in control of the process prompts us to, instead of doing it, set up all these detailed structures for not quite doing it.
So I'm curious, because it seems a lot of your work I don't know if a lot, but you referenced several times both Jung and James Hollis, who's a Jungian therapist.
Yeah.
And I was curious how your work has been informed by their work.
Well, James Hollis was my entry point to Jung. He's a Jungian, as you said, and I picked up a book of his called "Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life."
Mm-hmm.
Which
he's a Jungian analyst for people who don't know who he is. Yeah.
And even that title is, at one point I thought it was an unwise title because it sort of puts people off who are not willing to accept that they might be in the second half of life. But increasingly, I think it's very good sort of reader selecting title, because you sort of have to accept something about where you are in life before the message can even find you. And neither James Hollis nor Jung mean chronologically, of course. I think that when Jung talks about midlife, he talks about a thing that can sort of begin in your early 30s through to your late 60s, at least. It's to do with that moment when you feel that strategies and ways of living that have served you pretty well in early adulthood sort of seem to stop working, and the sort of the life and the liveliness in them seems to go away. And something there about, I mean, I'm not an expert on the work of Jung at all, but something about that focus on what the Jungians, I think, sometimes call generativity or maybe creativity, the sense that we're trying to understand what's going on and our backgrounds and our childhoods and everything for some purpose that this is all sort of moving towards, not because you have an incredibly specific destiny that you've got to discover and then put into practice necessarily, but just that sense of, perhaps with difficulty, perhaps with effort, trying to sort of become who we are, in that kind of famous phrase that doesn't really make sense, but it's the only way of saying it. I think that is a big part of what really appealed to me initially about both Hollis and Jung. And I begin the book with a quote from another Jungian, Marion Woodman, who says, it's easier to try to be better than you are than to be who you are, which I think points to this avoidance that is often there at the heart of a lot of self-help projects in our lives.
Well, and that makes so much sense in the Jungian philosophy in terms of this, what now has kind of been Instagram and TikTokized, I guess, if that's even a word, is the shadow work, right? I mean, that's what a lot of people talk about, but it's about paying attention to who you actually are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and embracing that part of yourself rather than trying to run from that.
Right. And it's, it speaks to something that feels really important to me, which is, not trying to kind of get up and out of your life and the reality that you actually are in, but become more and more a container for sort of all of it. And how that seems like defeat at first, because it feels like giving up the hope of becoming a sort of radically different, perfect sort of person. But in the end, it's actually that defeat is the sort of precondition for a much richer and deeper and more productive and accomplished experience of life. I don't think these are antithetical to each other at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you say defeat, I almost feel like it's surrender. Like you're just like, okay, right? Like waving the flag, like I'm mortal.
Yeah.
And once you accept that, I think everything can shift and change, because you're no longer necessarily living. If you can accept your mortality, then the pressures to be immortal don't necessarily feel as intense in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, completely.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think
seemed like maybe they got there through the back door, but
yeah, no, it's a nice way of putting it. And I think it's that it also relates to that thing I'm often emphasizing in this new book, that actually when you really, really, really accept, surrender to whatever our limitations, it's a liberation. It isn't if you sort of maybe half do it or don't really do it, then it's kind of depressing maybe. But if you actually understand, just on the level, to take one example, right, the level of busyness and overwhelm, very simple example of our limitations. You can't do everything that feels like it needs doing. If you think that you maybe could, with more discipline and a bit more yelling internally at yourself, and a really cool new productivity system that you found in a book you bought at the airport, then that's a horrible way to live, because there's something you're supposed to have done and you haven't done it yet. And
right.
That's because you're a big loser. But if you see that it's completely impossible, that there in fact will always be more to do than you will have time to do, and that your job is just to sort of swim through this infinite ocean rather than drink it all down, I suppose, to continue that metaphor. That's liberating. Seeing the real, you've pushed it another level, and you've made it clear that it's actually worse than you thought it was in a way. But it's better than that as a result, because now you're free to just do a handful of things that matter instead of frittering all your energy on that impossible goal.
Well, and I found myself too, like nodding my head several times in reading this, particularly. So you talk in the information about, in one of the chapters, about the amount of information that is now currently available to us, right? It used to be like we'd turn on and even before the nightly news, there was just the newspaper that showed up once a day at your doorstep. And that was the information that you had for the day. And maybe you turned on the radio and you got more information. And now we have information like just coming at us in gobs and gobs and gobs of, it feels like you could get buried in a day or in an hour under all the things that might be interesting, that you want to pursue, that you want to read, that you want to explore, that you want to pull the thread on. How do you recommend we manage the inordinate amount of information that might be information that we're curious about, or that we want to know more about or learn more about? I think there's so many more things now that are in our face that we would have never even thought about exploring, 75, 100, 150 years ago, because it was like you didn't know it was even a possibility to explore.
No, absolutely. And what goes for things to read and articles that might be useful for your career and all this stuff, that's a great example of this problem. But of course, the problem goes through to places to travel, ambitions, or obligations that you feel the culture is putting on you, or,
right.
all of these things. Right?
just in between I took a half-hour break and I was like, okay, well, what are the best countries in the world that I could travel to? And oh my God, I just saw something from McKinsey about spirituality as the new, mental health component of mental health.
Right.
And then it's like, okay. And, on Instagram today, I need to look at these 5 ways that I'm going to lose 20 pounds by next week. And, right. And they're all on some level, something that I'm interested in. Maybe not lose 20 pounds in 5 weeks, but you get where I'm going with that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that, again, the argument is one that the right response to this is one that understands that there's just an effectively infinite amount of stuff to read, just to pick that example, that would be useful. The task is not to separate the wheat from the chaff and make sure that you're only seeing and spending time on the stuff that really matters, because there's far too much stuff that really matters as well. So it's actually an act of saying, look, there isn't going to be time for me to read most of the things that, were I to read them, I'd be glad I'd read them. And so one of the sort of metaphors I use in the book is the idea of treating your to-read pile or list or whatever as a river rather than a bucket. So it's not something that fills up and you have to empty. It's something that just flows past you, or you're standing in the middle of in your river shoes or whatever, and you have to kind of, you pick a few things that look interesting as they float by, but you don't feel guilty about the fact that you haven't been able to stop the flow of the river, because that just was never on the cards to begin with. So
it's very meditative of you.
Well, I'm not a particularly great formal meditator, but I am very influenced by a lot of Zen stuff, a lot of other Buddhist thinking, and et cetera, et cetera. And and Taoism, I think, is the other influence sometimes on this kind of idea, right? It's like, actually the way to be effective in that situation is to let the river flow past you. It's not effective to attempt to get on top of it all.
And and as you were talking, or as I was reading, I was thinking about too, causes. You talk about this a little bit too, that there's so many causes. This just happened last night where someone reached out to me and was like, I don't even know where to begin with the suffering in the world. Mm-hmm. How do I help? Yeah. And I think, it feels like a mountain that's not even, you can't even get to the first summit. Yeah. If you start with everything that needs addressing. But you talk about this in the same way. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. I think we said before that the example of things to read was one example of many, and causes that deserve your time or volunteering or attention or money are the same. There are too many of them. The attention economy that we live in, and that people write news stories about these things and who try to raise funds for their organizations, happening inside that attention economy, the result is that, you are constantly bombarded by people competing for your attention and your compassion. And a few of them might be charlatans, but it's mainly not that they're wrong. It's just that they're all doing it, and that we are as individuals cannot possibly have a meaningful effect on all of that suffering. Now, some people take this as an argument for sort of disconnecting from the news and just sort of completely plowing your own furrow and not thinking about it. That could conceivably be right for some people, but I don't. It's not my argument. My argument is just that, as with everything else, once we see that this is the situation, we can hopefully give ourselves more permission to pick our battles and to say, if I am going to focus on one specific topic when it comes to or maybe two, when it comes to my charitable donations, or when it comes to any time I have for volunteering, if I'm going to focus on the plight of refugees, or I'm going to focus on some aspect of making
hurricane
my neighborhood
relief,
right, or making my neighborhood safer streets initiatives. There's obviously the whole point is there's endless amounts of these. I'm going to allow myself not to focus on the other ones, not because they don't matter, right? Not because I've convinced myself that actually, these other conflicts happening around the globe, or the other many complicated aspects of climate situation that lead maybe to the weather disruptions. Not that none of these things don't matter, or that they're not real, or that it's none of my business, but just because I'm finite and and I will have a greater effect if I pick some battles over others. And so, if someone says, I don't follow politics, I don't follow political news, there are people waiting in the wings to say, like, well, that's deeply irresponsible these days. But I think the correct response is like, well, okay, that would depend, right? What are you doing instead? If that's your way of keeping your head clear so that you can be useful at the food bank, at the soup kitchen, twice a week or something, then I say go for that. If it's just because you honestly think that nothing in the world outside your own four walls affects you in the long run, then I would probably want to argue with you. But so it's all about being honest about these trade-offs of energy and time, and not seeing it as some sort of defeat when we have to withdraw our attention from many areas.
Yeah, and I think that I have so much to say about that, but I think on so many levels, when we spread ourselves too thin, right, we can't give to anything,
right,
including perhaps ourselves, our partners, loved ones, family, friends, wherever the concentric or wherever the circles kind of move out from there.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we as a humanity are great at recognizing that. Like I think many people think they need to be all things to all people all the time in all kinds of ways. And if they're not, then they're going to be shamed, or, there's a lot of guilt that comes with, am I not giving enough attention to this, enough attention to that? And it's literally, I think that will kill us all if we all try to do that. But this notion of trade-offs, I think, is so important in any choice you make. And this is something I try to talk about in my therapy work with people. But elaborate with us on consequences of choices that we make.
So there's a quotation that I use and that you were probably familiar with before you saw the book, from the therapist Sheldon Kopp, who at the back of his great little book called If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him, has this list of, it's like a laundry list of deep wisdom for life, essentially, the way he describes it. And one of those entries is this: you're free to do whatever you like, you need only face the consequences. Mm-hmm. And what's so powerful about this to me, if I can try to explain it, I suppose the way I think of it is, again, because we're finite, can only be in one place at a time, and we don't have unlimited amounts of time, anything you decide to do with your time, with an hour, with a day, with a lifetime, will have negative consequences. At the very least, there'll just be the opportunity cost of the fact that you could have done something else with that time, and now you never will. If you use a week's vacation to visit Paris, you can't use that week's vacation for anything else ever again. You can't go to Rome with it. Maybe you'll go to Rome with another week, but then you'll be doing that instead of something else. And of course, this happens on much more sort of fine-grained day-to-day questions as well, but also on big decisions, right? It's like when you're faced, I give an example of a friend in the book, when you're faced with a question like whether to leave a relationship, people are often paralyzed because they think to themselves, well, they look at the idea of leaving and they think, well, that will be unacceptable because of all these consequences, all the pain I'd cause, and all this, disruption. So then they look at the other option, but then they see that has lots of negative consequences, like, remaining in a bad relationship, you put jobs in here, whatever, it's the same idea. That has all sorts of negative consequences. So they're sort of frozen and hoping against hope that some magic option C might come along that doesn't have negative consequences. But if you can see that everything has these trade-offs and consequences for us, then it becomes not necessarily easy, but a very simple question of just deciding in any given context which set of consequences you're willing to bear. So you might say to yourself, as in the example I give in the book, somebody who says, well, if I leave this relationship, it is going to cause a lot of anguish, but that's the consequence that I'm willing to shoulder. I will take responsibility for causing it, and I will do everything that I can to deal responsibly with it. And as a result, I won't be incurring this other consequence of, years of sort of stagnant misery for both partners in the relationship. And so that there's a kind of freedom there. It's not the freedom to sort of float above life and do exactly what you want and have no blowback, but it's the real freedom to see that your freedom of choice is in some sense always unlimited. Now, there are certain choices that people won't make because it would be completely pathological to do so, choices that would lead your children to starve or something, right? But the sort of existentialist insight, it's a bit sort of Jean-Paul Sartre, I think, what we're talking about here, is that a better way to phrase that is, I am unwilling to repudiate the responsibility that I have for feeding my children, right? It's actually always on me in some sense. And that's very powerful, I think, because it's a kind of deep freedom, not the kind of glib freedom of certain bad self-help books, which is just like, oh, you can just become a billionaire by deciding you're going to become a billionaire. It's easy. But the sort of deep freedom of seeing that all you ever have to do in life is choose between consequences, choose which problem you'd like to have.
Right. Well, and I love the question I wrote down is, what is the price and is it worth paying?
Right.
Which
Perfect.
I think is like, I mean, you could use that in every single thing in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly.
And even as we're talking, I've talked about this once before with my son who's 10, who literally like just a couple of weeks ago said something to me. I was like, are you a tiny Buddha? It's like, so mom, if I make one choice, then that means like I can't make the other choice that I could have made in that like option, was basically what he's saying. Like if I go down this road, then I can't also go down the other road.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my, how in your little 10-year-old mind did you just have this like poof, like this amazing awareness that adults don't get? Like when you go down one road, doesn't mean you can't maybe make your way towards the other one, but like that exact moment, that sliding door moment cannot happen again.
Right. The moment instantly vanishes. It's fascinating. I think that part of the reason that might be clearer. I mean, I'm at risk of suggesting that your son is not an unusually incredibly wise Buddha. So let me say, I'm sure he is.
Yeah, I would go with he's probably not.
But at the same time, I think what happens as adults is we sort of find all sorts of ways of arguing ourselves out of this, or of avoiding it, or enabling it. It's actually very simple. At the end of the day, I think we're just sort of returning to basic truths that may be easier for children to perceive. And yeah, we've spoken, and I was speaking anyway, about sort of big life choices, but I even think about this in the context of like, a time comes in the day when I would like to stop answering email because I would like to go and go for a walk up the hill outside our house before it's time for me to pick my son up from school, something like that. I can look at those emails. I can weigh up. I don't need to try to convince myself that nobody's going to be a little bit impatient if I don't reply, but I can weigh it up and say, you know what? And this is obviously partly a privileged thing to be able to say, but like I'm going to be okay if that little bit of impatience is triggered. I'm choosing this other thing that's worth more to me. And somebody might be in a different situation where if they didn't respond to all those emails, they were going to get fired. And they might say, that would have been really nice to go on that walk, but my goals in life and my intentions are better served by answering these emails. There's no right or wrong answer. What's wrong is to think that you just have to do it because that's the way it is. That's always slightly inaccurate.
Do you have a favorite meditation in here, like one that you just feel like that is one that I practice on the daily?
I mean, there's a couple of things. One that I do all the time is remind myself of the insight I try to express in the section on what I call decision hunting, which is sort of moving forwards especially in work and creative work by looking for decisions that one could take. So to give a very simple, down-to-earth example of that, I write this email newsletter, and it happens to me, or used to happen to me, that I would come up with sort of 4 or 5 ideas that seemed like they would be okay. And then I'd go for a walk with these ideas on a piece of paper, and I would implicitly be trying to figure out if one of them was good enough to do the newsletter about. And I would end up in all sorts of circles of ridiculous inner drama about this and wasting a huge amount of time. And, in the end, sometimes they'd be good newsletters and sometimes they wouldn't. So it didn't seem to really add up to anything. And then I sort of shifted that to telling myself that my job when I went out on that little walk after coming up with 5 ideas was to select one of them, right? It was not to figure out if one of them was good enough. It was to decide which one I was going to move forward with. Instantly, that act of choosing is just a much easier thing to do because I'm just choosing. I've got this list of 5 and I'm going to choose one of them. Anyone can do that. I might somehow make the wrong choice, I suppose, but you live and learn. What I'm not going to do is have to spend ages trying to figure out if one of them is good enough and all that stuff. This is a very sort of inside baseball writing kind of example, but I think that kind of, okay, just choose, make a choice is something that I find really, really empowering in day-to-day life. Just like book the train ticket that you can't work out which of the 2 days would be the best day to book it on. And I think
we are, so many people have decision paralysis.
Yeah.
Because of fear of making the wrong decision versus just making a choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that sort of reframe, I'm not even sure I've conveyed it properly in words, but what you just said then makes me reassure that I have. It's hard to put into words this shift from deciding, trying to figure out what's the best way forward versus choosing which of the available ways forward you are going to take.
Well, I think it's a subtle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's subtle, but I think that the most impactful things tend to be that subtle.
Right. Right.
Not different from everything that you're saying in this book. It's like you don't have to make these massive, 5-page write-ups of checklists upon checklists in order to make a change in your life. There are small, subtle things that you can do on a daily basis that over time make massive impact.
Yeah.
And we overcomplicate things.
Right. And by far the biggest skill that you're learning there, I think, is not even the persistence part of it or the patience part of it, but just the ability to actually do a thing. Right. Yeah. It's just that ability to be like, I found that life is better when I use a break to go for a walk. So I'm just going to direct my feet out of the door. Right. It's not, it's so easy to spend that whole time sort of daydreaming about how I'm going to become the kind of person who does that all the time. And,
right. And or thinking like every day, I'm going to be the person that walks out the door and takes a mile walk before dinner.
Right.
It's like,
right.
well, but
maybe you are, but the only way you're ever going to
to
become that person anyway is by actually doing it once, and then actually doing it once, and then actually doing it once, so.
Right. So what does your life look like on the daily as a result of these books? How has it shifted who you were to who you are now?
It's a good question. I mean, what I'm doing in everything I write really is grappling with the things that I find challenging and trying to either figure out the advice I need to hear right then, or at least sharing advice that's been useful for me pretty damn recently in the process. So, I found in both the cases of 4,000 Weeks and this new book that you do I get a pretty clear intellectual idea of the points I want to make early on, but then you really do have to kind of change your personality a bit in order to authentically write the book. So the project itself becomes a sort of therapeutic exercise. A big part of this new book is about sort of unclenching that desire for a feeling of control over things. And even though I thought I'd already done that as a writer, I sort of had to do it to a new level in this book. I had to sort of allow myself to do all sorts of free writing exercises that I'd previously been very, snotty about, and that I didn't think I thought were for sort of amateur writers, not for me or whatever. So I had to sort of get over myself a whole new layer just to find out what this book wanted to be, really, and to get it into reality. So the whole philosophy that I'm calling imperfectionism in this book is really something I had to practice in order to write the book. And, I think I'm a lot less anxious than I used to be, and somewhat less distractible, and probably easier to live with, although I feel like you've got to do a podcast with my wife, really, to get the information there. It's just
let me know when she's available.
It's a totally biased thing for me to tell you. Right, I think I'm easy to get along with.
I'm doing great in life, let me tell you.
And then, it's all by comparison to where you start from, isn't it? So I think I'm sure I'm still a bit more anxious than the sort of population baseline, although maybe not these days. I don't know.
Probably
maybe not. But you know what I mean? It's like I don't know if you know Bruce Tift's work, the psychotherapist Bruce Tift, but he says somewhere in some interview, or maybe it's in one of his books actually, that the there's a lot of freedom to be found even just in the reflection of like, maybe I'm never going to change. Maybe on some level, this thing that bothers me about myself is always going to be with me for the rest of my life. And so, I wouldn't say that I've gone from being a very anxious person to a totally chilled out person. I would say I've gone from being very anxious to, still somewhat prone to that kind of attitude towards life, but not entangled in trying to change it in a way that enables me to just do things and
Well, and isn't that very Buddhist? That's more of that Buddhist philosophy is like you're not engaging with the suffering. You're just acknowledging that it's there in that way.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that is Buddhist. I think that sense of being able to see, there's that thing coming up because this is happening, and that reminds me of whatever, and okay. And occasionally it'll be so powerful I can't really do much else for an hour or two until it subsides, and other times it's just like, all right, you get on with that, and meanwhile I'm going to carry on doing this thing that I was doing. I think that's Jung writes somewhere, right, about how the greatest problems that his patients brought to him were never sort of resolved. It was more like they'd been in a storm on the side of a mountain, and then they just carried on climbing the mountain until the storm was beneath them. but it was still there.
Yeah, it's interesting because the longer I do this work, the more I wonder, do we end up in some way where we started? Just with a different perspective.
The audio cut out at the absolutely critical moment there. The more you do this work, the more you do this work, the more you wonder.
Maybe it cut out on purpose. It was like, no, don't say that. The more I do this work, the more I wonder if we in some ways end up exactly where we started, just with a different perspective of that.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not sure there's anything that isn't that maybe that's the greatest thing ever. I think it's James Hollis who quotes, I'll get this wrong, but I love the idea. It quotes a New Yorker cartoon, or maybe not a New Yorker cartoon. Maybe it wasn't even a cartoon, but
if it's a psychotherapist joke, it's probably a New Yorker cartoon.
It is a psychotherapist joke, and it's a psychotherapist saying something like, I don't even remember the details, but it's something like he's responding to the client's question. He's saying like, happiness, so certainly not, but I can make your problems more interesting to you, or something like that. I mean, I've totally garbled this point, but the point that Hollis makes much more eloquently than me is that actually making your life more interesting to you and engaging is like that is not half measures. That's not settling for less. Like that's amazing.
Well, and that's engagement with life, I think, is the curiosity around it. Yeah. So, okay, so your new book, Meditation for Mortals, is out. It will be out by the time this airs, because I'm going to try to get this on next week, but it comes out tomorrow, right? October 8th?
As we speak, it is tomorrow, yeah.
Okay, that's so exciting. Where can't people find you, I guess, is a better question, because it seems like, I don't know, I don't know if it's that people knew I was interviewing you, but I saw you like popped up on like 4 feeds at the
I'm very glad to hear it. The great
it sounds
publicity
like it's already
work,
a bestseller.
The great publicity work by the great people at the publishers is working. Fantastic.
It is working because you're already on lists and the book isn't even out yet.
The book is wherever you buy your books. There's an audiobook read by me as well. And then my website, oliverburkeman.com, has other stuff like the newsletter, etc.
Well, Oliver, thank you so much for your time. Good luck tonight on your interview here in Chicago. Even though you're not in Chicago, you're in DC. So I always like to see when I beat fan to the punch, because they always have amazing guests on. So I'm excited that I had you as a Chicagoan first here.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And just really grateful for your time and excited for this book. I think it's a great bedside book, in that just keep it by your bedside. And it's one of those books you can just pick up, flip to a page, I think, and find something insightful that you need for that day. You can almost use it. This might be a little woo for you, Oliver, but you can almost use it as like a tarot deck in that way, or like a oracle deck, in that you just like flip to whatever page and see what it shows you for that day. And I feel like that's exactly what you will need to hear.
I love that idea. Getting more comfortable with woo has been a big part of my life's project. So that's great.
Well, you came to the right place. So here we are with the woo. So I love that. And I love both your books. And thank you for your contributions to the world. I think they are making a difference, and that I know feels great. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.